Welcome, welcome, welcome to Health Issues. I'm your host, Chris Sylvain, and believe me, I am thoroughly excited about today. We have an awesome guest for you, and it's Dr. Steve Sheffrin. He has a PhD in economics. He's a director of the Murphy Institute. He got his PhD from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Awesome resume, tons of books, articles. Welcome, Dr. Sheffrin.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Appreciate having you. And when we first talked with the group over at Tulane, we spoke about this conversation would be looking at the two presidential candidates, and if we can just kind of walk through it, and how were their policies, your thoughts on it affecting, say, the everyday guy on the street, and let's compare and contrast.
Be glad to. When I think about the candidates and their platforms, I ask myself four questions. What are they actually saying? What's the proposals? Would they be enacted by Congress? If they were, would this be good or bad? And finally, what's kind of the broader vision? So let me start with Secretary Clinton. Her big idea is she wants to raise taxes about $1 trillion over 10 years and use those funds to have programs which would benefit a wide variety of people. Her big programs are infrastructure investments, maybe $300 billion in infrastructure investment. Some of that would be new energy and some jobs and so forth. The other big program she has is to make college debt-free for people whose incomes are below like $125,000, and also give some debt relief. Now she has 50 pages of platform, and many other proposals, but those are her big ideas. Would they be enacted? Well, the problem is if the House stays Republican, there's basically zero chance that she would get any of these policies through, because all her policies would basically tax people in the top 1%. They would involve taxes on people who make $5 million, who make $1 million. I think the lowest you probably could have your taxes go up, but you have to have at least $200,000. So the House isn't going to do that. They're not going to let her spend the money. Well, what about if she did get it through, if somehow the House changed? Well, I think in that case, you'd have to ask themselves, are the programs themselves good? And on the education, you can see the benefits of people in going debt-free, but actually implementing that, the experts who've looked at that say it's very difficult, because some states, for example, charge a lot tuition, some states charge a little. How are you going to design the program? And the colleges, I know from a fact, having been out at the public university in California, are extremely nervous about this plan, right? The infrastructure investment, I think most people think it's a good idea, and as I'll say in a second, Donald Trump also thinks it's a good idea as well. I think the one biggest weakness in her, two biggest weaknesses in her plan, is there's nothing really to get the private sector moving again, right? It's all very public oriented. Even the infrastructure program, it's mostly public sector and maybe 25 billion or so for an infrastructure bank, but it's just not very big. And the other issue she doesn't deal with is really on the corporate tax issue. We have a real corporate tax problem in the United States. Her view is to make it more difficult for U.S. companies to be bought abroad, but she's not. Our tax rate's so high compared to other places that creates difficulties. Turning over to Donald Trump for a minute, he's the exact opposite. So he has a big tax cut, and of course everyone likes tax cuts. Tax cut would go to the middle class and so forth. The difficulty with this tax cut, though, it doesn't pencil out, and it would create a very large deficit, and so that's a problem. This is his third tax plan he's come up with, and this is the best one, but there's still a big deficit in there. He does have a corporate tax plan which would bring business tax rates down to 15%. That's something that's close to what the people in the House, representatives in the House, are interested in, and that would actually probably be a productivity augmenting program, and that might have a chance of passing. But the House wouldn't let him pass a big program. He also wants infrastructure investment. Both he and Hillary Clinton also want to do things for maternity leave and for child care. I think Hillary started it first. I think Donald Trump then copied it a little bit. Both are interested in increasing the minimum wage. So Donald Trump is running a bit as a Democrat on some of these issues as well. I think the big difference, though, is his emphasis on the private sector as opposed to the government sector. So his explicit goal, is to try to raise economic growth, and he would love to raise it from our 1.5%, 2% where we are now up to 4%. That's his goal. And whether he could accomplish that is not clear, but the vision is to get the private sector unleashed, right? Cut back government regulations, get the private sector unleashed, make it easy for small business to do things. But I would say, all in all, because he has this big hole in his budget deficit with his tax plan, he doesn't have all the answers there as well. So Secretary Clinton basically raised taxes on the rich to try to jumpstart government spending, right? Maybe a little on healthcare, but mostly on like infrastructure, college loans, students, and so forth. And for Trump, kind of unleash the private sector, unleash small businesses. And so, in that sense, this is kind of a very, they differ in their details, but this is kind of a very traditional plan. You go back to, Ronald Reagan, and people with Ronald Reagan, the same criticisms of Reagan you hear about Trump today. Oh, his plan doesn't balance. The tax cuts would cause big deficits. And they did, but he fixed it eventually. But it was emphasis on the private sector and entrepreneurship, where he was running against an opponent who basically said, no, we have to raise more taxes, we need more government spending. And the government spending needs, of course, are legitimate, but those require more taxes. So that's what you have, kind of a private-oriented, jump-starting approach of Trump, and sort of tax the rich transfer program of Secretary Clinton.
Okay, question. First thing,
Sure.
For Mr. Trump, how does he actually expect to spur private sector growth and private sector investment to build small businesses, entrepreneurship, to bring jobs?
Right. So, particularly with respect to his business tax plan, and there's some ambiguity there, how far it extends to small business, just corporations. But he's going to allow, for example, he proposes to allow corporations to write off their entire investment in their first year. Okay. So if you buy a machine that's worth, say $1 million, you can write that off the first year. Now, small businesses already do that. There's already that proposal there. Right. He's going to also disallow businesses to deduct interest payments. So that's how he pays for this. So he's going to basically encourage capital investment by business by doing that. Okay. There's some ambiguity about whether his plan applies to small business or not. Let's say you have your own business, and you file a Schedule C, right, on your tax. Well, that's on your personal tax return. Are you going to get the 15%, or are you going to get the higher rate? So even as of last weekend, there was still some ambiguity about whether Trump's plan would apply, the 15% rate would apply to all of businesses or just the corporations. But the basic idea is he would lower the rates and create incentives for people to make the investments, and that's his vision. So it's private sector investment oriented approach.
Okay, question. Let's take New Orleans, a city, any city like New Orleans or whatever, which is many of the big cities. And if we look at the level of poverty, throughout the cities, am I correct to say that after World War II, the Marshall Plan, there's no way to attack this level of poverty without building businesses within the communities themselves to create business owners and put these people to work? Is that?
I think that's right. I think that ultimately, it'd be nice if we had really large firms here operating, but we don't. We don't. Right. So it's going to require small businesses and growing small businesses to big businesses, and that requires a lot, right? As you know, it requires having the workforce, right, to be able to, the workforce to have the skills to do that. Right. And we're working on the schools in New Orleans, and they're improving, but it's a slow process. Okay. We need the college graduates, right? And we don't want to cut back on higher education, which we've been doing a little bit, because that's one part. But we also need the entrepreneurs. And starting a business is very difficult these days. The city of New Orleans is a great city, but the city bureaucracy, when you're trying to start a business, is actually a little difficult. All the permits you have to get and everything you have to do to get started. And even at the federal level these days, I mean, just the type of paperwork that you need to start a small business is absolutely daunting. My wife was doing some work, and she had it took her like a week and a half to figure out how to, get her LLC status set up and everything, and without a lot of help, it's very, very difficult. So I think the regulatory structure is an issue, and we want to make that as streamlined and as easy as possible. And then you also have to basically have the incentives for the businesses. So if they're doing a lot of capital investment, right, then they need to be able to get a tax break for that to be able to start. And so right now, if you're small enough, you do get to write off in the first year all your computers and your equipment purchases. But if you get larger, you don't have that. And so that's what's in Trump's plan. But I do think that I do think at the end of the day, having a lot of small businesses and having those potential for some of those to grow, employ people, train people, provide benefits is the way for a city like New Orleans or any other city for it to grow. And cities that are growing faster than us, like Houston and places like that, they are good environments for small business. And I think you'd see a lot of growth because of that.
That makes sense, because I think it's critical to the whole conversation, because even we look at either one of those plans, I don't think anything I've heard from Mr. Trump, definitely not Secretary Clinton, address capital needs for small businesses, because they need money. You know what I mean? And many of the consumer-oriented small businesses don't have a lot of capital investment.
Right.
You know, they're not buying huge dollar things.
One of the we had this financial crisis, and one of the outcomes of the financial crisis was that we were really worried about the stability of the system, the big firms going down, and it caused tremendous damage when they did. Our strategy for dealing that with was to put another layer of regulation on, and in effect, what that meant is that the larger financial firms, they have an easier time dealing with the regulation. They have all the lawyers and the accountants, and you put an extra layer of bureaucracy on them, they can deal with it. But the smaller banks and smaller financial institutions can't. So if you look to see how the financial system, where the money is concentrated now, the bigger financial firms are bigger than they were before, and the community banks, in fact, are suffering a little bit. And you know for yourself that for local loans, the community banks actually are important, because they will know the track record of local entrepreneurs, and they'll know, in fact, whether someone is to be trusted and whether they're going to venture their money forward. Right. And if you're dealing with, J.P. Morgan or Wells Fargo, and you're dealing with these big companies, well, you can fill out the forms, but they're not going to know you individually.
Exactly.
And so it's important to get financial flows into, for capital for the new businesses in there as well. And so it's important to have a regulatory structure that allows the community banks and so forth to flourish. Now, there's no proposal either by Secretary Clinton or by Donald Trump to do that, but it's part of the general reaction to the fact that we have so many regulations. And Trump does want to, cut back some regulations, but you have to cut back the right ones. You don't want to cut back the wrong ones. You don't want to allow another 2007 financial crisis to start again. But you do want to be able to get capital into the small businesses.
Yeah, and as you said that, unless we do that, show me, is there a path to the presidency? Is there another path to dealing with these totally impoverished neighborhoods and in schools? Obviously, government jobs, somebody would have to show me how that's going to make a major difference in changing the level of poverty. It may put a better Band-Aid on it.
Right. I mean, I think at this point, neither. I mean, I do think there could be, in Secretary Clinton's plan, there could be some jobs that would be created through our infrastructure program and through other programs. But I think in the long run, the American people don't have the appetite for a massive expansion of the government sector. If anything, they want to cut back, and government jobs that are run by the city, they're constrained by the property taxes, by local economics, and so it's going to be hard to have a massive influx of government jobs. So the trick is to be able to have maybe jumpstart some things, maybe have some infrastructure that allow private sector to develop. And so I think the infrastructure investment is very good. Trump made the point that interest rates are really low now, and when interest rates are low, we should be doing a lot of investing, and so it's a good time for infrastructure investment, even if you had to borrow money to do so. And I think that's why both Secretary Clinton and Trump are suggesting that we ought to invest in infrastructure. Now, how that translates from the federal level down to the state, down to New Orleans, and down to the neighborhoods is a tricky question. And we know it's not going to happen right away, and we know that even if it's 200, 300 billion at the federal level, there's only a little bit going to come down. So we're going to still need the people graduating from the schools, right? We're still going to need people who are well trained by the local colleges, who have the skills, and who are being employed by local entrepreneurs in order to make things go.
I think that statement you said, if we can put it on a billboard, I think that is a statement. I don't see any step that we can take away from it. Let's say the Ninth Ward, or Uptown, or whatever. The policies that would affect the Ninth Ward. If they're good for $8 an hour, $1 trillion in public sector investment, they'll go up to $850 and $950. I mean, it doesn't move the needle. Am I correct?
Right, I think that's right, and and it doesn't mean that small policies might not help. I mean, generally economists don't like minimum wage increases because they think it freezes out some people in the market who could work and couldn't work. But nonetheless, the people who do get the jobs at higher minimum wage would have a little more income, and it might make them better off. But again, these are really small things. These are small changes, and for transformational issues, you do need new businesses coming in. And the nice thing about New Orleans is there has been an influx of some new talent into the city, and there's a lot of younger people coming into the city, and there's some entrepreneurs coming into the city. And so I think that's a very positive thing. And there's only so much that regardless, there's only so much that can be done at the federal level, regardless. Okay. And so, in some sense, a year from now, regardless of who's elected president, we're not going to see a transformation in the Ninth Ward overnight. This is going to be a longer process. And so we keep having to doing our fundamental things of training, education, providing funds, business loans for people, and encouraging entrepreneurship, streamlining bureaucracy. All those things are going to be important for the city to grow.
Okay, question. If we look back historically then, I'm sure there must be models to say to, I keep going back to the Marshall Plan and World War II and so forth. What are some good models to say that if somebody decided that they wanted to go into, say, the Ninth Ward in New Orleans or whatever part of town in Baton Rouge and say, hey, we're going to really affect change in these areas, these policies have worked. They worked 100 years ago, they worked 50 years ago, and if they would just enact these policies, we can see some changes.
I wish I had a blueprint of the policies to make it work, but
really,
I mean, I think when you think about the Marshall Plan, there you had basically a society that was hurt by the war,
okay.
But fundamentally, people were trained, and there was the kind of local capacity to be able to do things, right?
Okay.
There was a high level of social capital, of human capital, and so what was needed was an influx of funds to get people back to where they were before. Because before World War II, if you think about these countries, they were living in a pretty nice place. They obviously had leaders that took them into a terrible war, which cost them and their countries great tragedy. But they were business was conducted. They were at a level. So a Marshall Plan type approach really presupposes you have the fundamentals in place before.
Okay.
And the problem with the poorer places in New Orleans or Baton Rouge is that the fundamentals aren't there. The fundamentals aren't there. You don't have the education, the training, the broad infrastructure there. So that's the difficulty. Now we've tried, and every place in the country has tried enterprise zone plans and those sort of things,
right.
and they just don't work. They just don't work. You can tell at the state level in Louisiana we keep modifying the enterprise zone plans, but they're not. They've been around ever since the 1960s, and we've had a series of programs really since the 1960s. You think about them. That were 8 model cities, aid to the programs, and so forth. And roughly what's happened is that any broad economic trend has trumped them, if you will, so to speak. The big trend that the hardest thing for the middle class, not necessarily for New Orleans per se, but for the middle class, has been when we opened up to trade, and the trade with China was so large, and that all of a sudden, you take people in North Carolina, who were doing textiles and so forth. Well, they just couldn't compete when you opened up to China, right? So you don't make the same sort of things you do those places. And here are people who were, had decent jobs and were in their 40s and 50s. All of a sudden, were displaced because of things were going elsewhere. And so that type of low-cost manufacturing is very hard to sustain in a global economy. So what you need people who either can work at higher parts in the service sector or have particular skills where they can actually work in higher level manufacturing, because that's so that's the real challenge for us. We can't go back and recreate those jobs that people were in the textile mills in North Carolina. In a global economy, you're competing with people from China, from Vietnam, from Thailand, who are willing to basically to work at much lower wages, and if the skill level is the same, you're going to lose that all the time. And so that's an additional challenge. That's what makes this current situation even more challenging. And certainly Donald Trump's appealing to those people. Whether he has an answer to those, it's not clear. So there's a couple other. I mean, the other aspect I kind of didn't talk about was kind of on trade. And what's interesting is when Trump came out, he was very certainly was anti-trade, and his rhetoric is still anti-trade. He thinks trade deals, the U.S. has gotten hurt by the trade deals and so
Mexico,
forth.
the whole bit.
And Mexico and the wall and so forth like that. What's interesting is Secretary Clinton, who basically was a free trader during most of her time, and said that the Trans-Pacific Partnership was the gold standard of trade agreement. She gets pushed in the primary to basically oppose that. And so now she's on record and as opposing that. So it'll be very hard for her to turn around. But I do think in the long run, trade would be good, even though it poses this challenge. And I think who's ever elected is going to have to be very careful. We don't want to close ourselves off. If you look at Detroit, for example, Detroit now makes good cars. So you can go and buy a good American car. It gets good reviews in Consumer Reports. That wasn't true many years ago. And the reason is you had the Japanese car makers come in and they raised the standards. And I think that kind of trade, that kind of competition is good for people. And I think that's why we have to keep things open for trade.
Good. I mean, it's good. And I'll carry it a bit further. So if we look at the trade policies or whatever Mr. Trump's speaking about, the average American is saying, "Hey, I can't compete with the pennies per hour that they're making someplace else," and so unless they receive training and education, they actually won't be able to participate in the economy, no matter what policies that are placed in. But what about how technology is changing the playing field? Uber, some of the things that are going on as far as for the that pickup economy or whatever, as far as for creating opportunities for entrepreneurs to be able to compete, with the big boys, so to speak.
Right. I mean, if you look at the firms that we consider the gold star firms today,
right.
Apple, Google, they weren't around when we were growing up, right?
Exactly.
They were all new people, and Uber, obviously, Uber can be something where someone can just sort of eke out some extra cash, or it could be something that someone could do who just needs to get going, and try something out. So there are a lot of opportunities, and the technology, if technology is smart enough, it can enable people with a variety of skills. Uber is an example of something where you have a technology that enables a high level of service, right? Someone in Thailand and China can't pick you up at your house and drive you across town to your restaurant, right? And someone in China can't take care of your kind of service needs. But your service needs could be improved. The service sector can be improved tremendously, and that's going to require people who are both intelligent, adaptable, willing to use technology. And as you point out, there are some opportunities there too. What we call in economics non-traded goods, the goods that you can't ship from China, right, are the goods produced locally, and we can improve the quality of those goods and create new opportunities for that. So the whole sharing economy, Airbnb, Lyft, Uber, is all part of that, and it has created some new opportunities. But you do have to still be sophisticated to be able to use those tools and be able to be adaptable. The good thing is you see all young people walking around with cell phones, and they seem to know how to do everything, and so maybe there is some hope after all.
Yeah, that's the point. I mean, it's almost to the point whereas, technology these days, nobody reads manuals, because technology comes where you can just grab it, and
right.
Young kids are able to move. I always wondered then if we ever put business financing into that mix, where we actually went into communities and flushed the entrepreneurs, startups, and current entrepreneurs with the type of cash that they need, that because of the new technological age, has that ever been tried anywhere?
Well, there are people who are trying this now. It's challenging though, because if you still lend money to someone who doesn't pay it back, you still lose money, right?
True.
But what people might want to do is they might want to contribute a small amount to a fund, which then gets pulled over the internet, right? And then some people then will make loans will make local loans to people, and so the people lending the money, just like you put your money in the bank, you don't know where the bank's lending it. The same thing can happen over the internet now.
Exactly.
I don't have to put my money into my JP Morgan account or my Chase account for to lend it out. Maybe I could invest some over the internet. It could be pooled, and people with expertise could kind of make low business loans. Or in fact, people who say, well, I want to in fact make investments which will help New Orleans. I want to make investments which will help the inner city or help areas which are struggling. And so people might say, well, I view this partly as charity, but also partly as an investment opportunity. And entrepreneurs could come in that space and they could say, well, gee, I'm going to try to raise money this way and lend it out. Now, there's obviously certain regulations about that. We don't want people to be fleeced on the internet forth, but that's possible. So can finance be done like that? In developing countries, we have this microfinance, right. In India. So there, basically very small amounts of money were advanced to women in India who were seamstress and may have very little small factories, and that seems to be a very positive effect. Most analysts of that think that the microfinance has great potential there. Well, there's certainly possibilities for that here, and that microfinance could get more macro, get a little bigger with the appropriate internet technology. I'm personally not an expert on that, but it seems to me it's feasible, and it could tie in again with the idea of using the new information technology in order to get entrepreneurs another foot up.
Yeah, because these days entrepreneurs can operate. They don't need secretaries or anything else like that. They're able to cloud bit and so forth. One last question, though. Well, not last, but we have a couple of minutes. This idea, though, from Mr. Trump or Secretary Clinton, again, for impoverished New Orleans, just to reiterate, other than building small businesses and homegrown from the people within the communities, because hey, if Walmart pops in the community, that doesn't help the community. I mean, it's sucking money out the community, but where that money can circulate. So there literally has not been another method to build wealth in the community other than through building entrepreneurs from the community.
Building entrepreneurs. I mean, I don't want to minimize the importance of sort of education. Also, giving people a safety net so that if they have difficult times, they could fall back. So you obviously want to make sure that things like the food stamps and the basic programs, and you want people to have basic levels of health care and things like that. That puts a floor. That puts a floor. But it doesn't get people moving. Now you could, it's hard to give low-income people tax cuts because they don't pay many taxes, right? Exactly. So that's not going to work.
Exactly.
And so, and you can expand the earned income tax credit. That's a policy that has been very popular both with Democrats and Republicans. But again, it only operates at a very small margin for people, and eventually, as you earn a little more, you kind of phase out. So it's income support. It does encouraging people to get work. I think getting people in the labor force itself to work is important. I mean, one of the more discouraging statistics is to see all the people who have simply dropped out of the labor force, and that always was true in urban areas, but now we're seeing people in their 50s and their 40s kind of disengaging. And when you do that, you don't keep up with technology, you don't keep up with skills, and that's going to be hurtful in the long run.
Real good. I don't think we have any more time. Excited. We appreciate you, Dr. Sheffrin, and we appreciate all that you're doing. Hey, work as hard as you can, learn as much as you can, but let's keep on pushing to build community. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.